Get on your knees if you're not going to pay for it. The words cut clean through the low hum of fluorescent lights and barcode scanners, sharp enough to turn heads in every aisle. For a moment, even the automatic doors at the front seemed to hesitate before sliding shut with a soft mechanical sigh. Walter Hayes didn't move right away. He stood there in the middle of the supermarket's front corridor, just past the checkout lanes, his fingers wrapped tightly around a crinkled plastic bag that held nothing more than a loaf of day-old bread and a small carton of milk. His coat hung loose on his frame, too thin for the early winter chill outside, the fabric worn soft at the edges like it had forgotten what new felt like. A few feet in front of him, Gregory Steele stood with his arms crossed, posture rigid, name tag gleaming under the overhead lights like a badge of authority he wore proudly. His voice hadn't been loud, but it didn't need to be. There was something in the way he said it, controlled, practiced, that carried farther than shouting ever could. Around them, carts slowed. A woman near register 3 paused mid-scan, her hand hovering over a box of cereal. A teenage cashier glanced up, then quickly backed down, pretending to focus on the receipt printer that had suddenly become very interesting. Phones began to lift, subtle at first, then more openly, little black rectangles angled just enough to capture the moment without drawing attention to the person holding them. Walter's eyes flickered once, not toward the crowd, but toward the floor tiles beneath his shoes. White squares with faint gray lines, polished enough to reflect a distorted version of everything above them. He shifted his weight slightly, the bag rustling in his grip, the sound quiet but unmistakable in the growing stillness. I said, Gregory continued, taking a slow step closer, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the tile. If you're going to take something without paying, you're going to follow store policy. There was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth, not warm, not kind, just certain. Walter finally looked up, his gaze steady, his face lined with years that had not been gentle, but had not broken him either. There was no anger there, no panic, just a quiet clarity that didn't seem to match the situation unfolding around him. I wasn't leaving, Walter said, his voice low, even, carrying just enough to reach Gregory and no one else. I was going to pay. I just needed a minute. The words hung in the air, simple and unadorned, offering no defense beyond their truth. Gregory tilted his head slightly, as if considering them, then let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. A minute you don't have, he replied, gesturing lightly toward the registers. People who can pay, pay first. That's how this works. Another step closer. The space between them shrank, the tension thickening like something physical. Walter's grip on the bag tightened, his knuckles pressing faintly against the thin plastic, but he didn't step back. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant beeping of a scanner restarting somewhere and the soft whir of the store's ventilation system. Gregory's gaze dropped briefly to the bag, then back to Walter's face. Go ahead, he said, his tone flattening, losing even the hint of patience it pretended to have. Set it down. And kneel. The word landed heavier than the rest, settling into the space between them like something that didn't belong but wasn't leaving. A murmur rippled faintly through the nearby shoppers, quickly swallowed as people looked away, unsure where to place their eyes. Walter didn't respond immediately. He drew in a slow breath, the kind that filled his chest, and held there for just a second longer than usual, as if measuring something invisible. His shoulders rose slightly, then eased. Carefully, almost deliberately, he lowered the bag to the floor beside his worn shoes. The plastic crinkled again, louder this time in the quiet. His hands lingered there for a moment, resting lightly on top of it, before he straightened back up. For a heartbeat, he simply stood there, an old man under harsh lights, surrounded by strangers who suddenly felt very far away. Then, without rushing, without looking at Gregory again, Walter began to bend, his movements slow, controlled, as if each inch carried weight beyond his years. The tile was cold even through the thin fabric of his pants as one knee lowered toward it, the reflection beneath him shifting, breaking, reforming into something unsteady. The store seemed to hold its breath, suspended in that single moment where something small and ordinary had quietly become something else entirely. Walter Hayes felt the cold of the tile long before his knee fully touched it, a quiet chill that seeped through worn fabric and into bone, But he did not flinch, he did not rush, and he did not look up again, his gaze settling somewhere just ahead of him, as if there was a point on the floor that only he could see, something steady in a space that had suddenly become unsteady for everyone else. And around him the supermarket continued in fragments rather than motion. A cart will creaked faintly. As someone shifted their weight, a child asked a question that was quickly hushed, and the soft hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, filling the silence that no one wanted to break. Gregory Steele watched him with the same rigid posture, but something in his expression sharpened, as if the compliance he had demanded did not satisfy him the way he expected it to, as if there was something missing from the scene he had constructed. "That is better," Gregory said after a moment, his voice carrying just enough to remind everyone who was in control, though it lacked the certainty it held seconds before. Walter's hands rested loosely against his thighs, fingers slightly curled, not clenched, not trembling, just still, his breathing slow and measured, the kind that came from years of learning how to endure moments that asked more from you than they should. And if anyone had been close enough, they might have noticed that his eyes were not empty. They were present, aware, holding onto something deeper than the situation in front of him, something older than the bright lights and polished floors. Gregory glanced briefly toward the nearest cashier, a young man who immediately looked away, his shoulders tightening as he pretended to reorganize a stack of plastic bags. "Call security," Gregory added. Though he did not take his eyes off Walter, the instruction hanging in the air like an afterthought that still carried weight. A phone lifted higher now from somewhere near the refrigerated section, the faint red light of recording reflecting in the glass doors behind it. Capturing everything without asking permission, Walter shifted slightly, adjusting his balance on one knee, the movement small but deliberate, and for the first time since he lowered himself, he spoke again, not louder, not pleading, just steady. "I said I was going to pay," he repeated, the words simple, unchanged, as if truth did not need to evolve to be heard. Gregory exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that hinted at irritation. "You can explain that to security," he replied, his tone flattening again, returning to the structure he understood: rules, authority, order, things that fit neatly into place. Unlike the quiet resistance in front of him that refused to behave the way it should, a woman near the front of the line shifted her purse from one shoulder to the other, her eyes flicking between Walter and the exit as if calculating how quickly she could leave without drawing attention to herself. Another man coughed softly, then cleared his throat as if to erase the sound. The store had not stopped, but it had narrowed, everything focusing inward on a single point that no one could ignore. Walter's gaze lifted just slightly now, not toward Gregory, not toward the crowd, but toward the glass doors at the entrance, where the outside world pressed faintly against the boundary of the store. Gray sky, a hint of wind moving through the parking lot, a shopping cart rolling slowly across a distant row, free from hands, free from direction, and for a brief moment, something in his expression softened, not into weakness, but into memory, as if he had seen something beyond the present that steadied him in a way no one else could understand. The bag of bread and milk sat beside him, untouched, ordinary, almost invisible now, yet it held the reason for everything unfolding, a small need that had turned into a spectacle. Gregory followed his line of sight for a fraction of a second, then dismissed it, bringing his focus back, tightening his stance, reinforcing the boundary between them. "Stay right there," he said, though Walter had not moved, the command more for himself than for the man already kneeling. And somewhere beyond the doors, the faint sound of a car engine grew closer, unnoticed by most, blending into the background of a moment that had already taken hold of the room. The sound of the engine outside grew just loud enough to brush against the edges of the moment, a low, controlled hum that slipped through the glass doors each time they opened and closed for passing customers. But no one inside paid it any attention, not yet, because inside, the tension had settled into something heavier than noise, something that pressed quietly against every breath taken in the room. Walter Hayes remained on one knee, his posture unchanged, his back not bent in defeat but held in a quiet line of dignity that did not belong to the position he had been forced into. And Gregory Steele shifted his stance again, a subtle adjustment that betrayed a flicker of discomfort he could not quite name. his eyes scanning the scene, as if searching for confirmation that he was still in control, that the order he believed in was still intact. "Security should be here any second," he said, more to fill the silence than to inform anyone, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind the onlookers of the role he played. Though fewer people were looking at him now, their attention drawn instead to the man on the floor who refused to collapse into the image being imposed on him. Walter's gaze drifted once more toward the entrance, the automatic doors sliding open again with their familiar mechanical rhythm, and this time, something shifted, not in sound, but in presence. A figure stepped through, tall, composed, dressed in a dark tailored coat that caught the light in. Clean lines, his shoes striking the tile with a measured pace that did not hurry and did not hesitate. Daniel Hayes entered without announcement, without noise beyond the natural rhythm of his steps. Yet the air around him seemed to tighten as he moved forward, a few customers instinctively stepping aside without fully realizing why. As if something in his presence suggested direction even without a word, his eyes moved across the store in a quick, practiced sweep, taking in details the way someone accustomed to making decisions did, the registers, the lines, the scattered stillness, and then they landed, not immediately on Gregory, not on the small cluster of employees near the front, but on the single figure kneeling under the harsh lights, and for a fraction of a second, his stride slowed, barely noticeable to anyone else, but enough to break the rhythm he had carried in. Walter did not look up right away, but something in him seemed to register the shift, the way a room changes when a door opens even if you do not see who walks through. Gregory noticed the new arrival only after a few seconds, his attention drawn by the subtle movement of people creating space, and he turned slightly, his expression resetting into something more formal, more performative. "Sir, we are handling a situation," he began, his tone smoothing into the version he reserved for customers who looked like they expected a certain level of service. But Daniel did not respond. Not yet, his focus fixed, narrowing, the distance between him and Walter closing one step at a time. The sound of his shoes against the tile now clear in the quiet, deliberate. Each step measured as if he was walking toward something he was not entirely prepared to see. Walter's head lifted slowly this time, drawn. Not by command, but by something else, something quieter, something familiar that did not belong to the fluorescent lights or the sterile aisles. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that instant, the noise of the store seemed to recede even further, replaced by a silence that carried weight. Recognition did not arrive all at once. It moved through Daniel's expression like a shadow crossing light. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something deeper that tightened his jaw and stilled his breath. Gregory continued speaking, unaware of the shift unfolding beside him. "He attempted to leave without paying, and we have procedures for that." His words sounding increasingly distant, like they were no longer the center of the moment. Daniel stopped just a few feet away now, his posture no longer casual, no longer neutral, his shoulders squared not in authority, but in something far more personal. His gaze locked onto Walter as if the rest of the world had fallen away. Walter held that gaze, steady, unflinching, not with expectation, not with hope, but with a quiet acceptance that seemed to carry years behind it. The bag of bread and milk sat between them on the floor, a small, ordinary object that now felt like the only thing anchoring the scene to reality. And for a heartbeat that stretched longer than it should have, no one spoke. The room suspended between what had been happening and what was about to change. Daniel Hayes did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than anything Gregory Steele had said so far, because it was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition settling into place, heavy and undeniable. His eyes remained fixed on Walter Hayes, tracing the lines of his face as if searching through years that had passed without warning, without permission. And for a moment his composure fractured just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for the air around him to shift. Gregory cleared his throat softly, attempting to reclaim the structure of the moment. "Sir, like I was saying, we are addressing a theft situation, store policy requires." But his words slowed as Daniel lifted one hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just a small, controlled gesture that asked for quiet and expected it, and Gregory stopped mid-sentence. The authority he had been holding on to slipping just enough to expose uncertainty beneath it. Daniel took another step forward, closing the final distance until he stood directly in front of Walter, the overhead lights casting a clear line between them, one standing, one kneeling, an image that seemed to echo something deeper than the situation itself. Walter did not lower his eyes. He did not look away. Instead, he held Daniel's gaze with the same quiet steadiness he had carried from the beginning. And that steadiness seemed to unsettle Daniel more than anything else, because it was familiar, because it belonged to a version of the world he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. His breath caught slightly, subtle but real, and when he finally spoke, his voice was not the controlled tone of a man used to boardrooms and negotiations. It was lower, rougher, like it had to move through something before it could be heard. "Stand up," he said, the words directed not as a command of authority, but as something closer to a request that carried urgency beneath it. Walter did not move immediately, not because he refused, but because he was measuring the moment in the same careful way he had measured everything else. His hands pressed lightly against his thigh as he prepared to rise, and as he did, Daniel stepped forward instinctively, his hand reaching out, not grabbing, not forcing, just offering support in a way that felt unfamiliar to the space they were in. Walter accepted it without hesitation, his weight shifting as he pushed himself up from the cold tile. The movement slow, deliberate, and when he stood fully, the difference between them was no longer height or position, but something quieter, something carried in the space between their eyes. Gregory watched the exchange with a growing tension he could not hide, his posture tightening again as he tried to reassert control. "Sir, I need you to understand. This man was caught attempting to leave without paying. We have protocols." His voice was sharper now, edged with the need to justify, to explain, to hold on to the version of events that made sense to him. But Daniel did not look at him. Not yet. His attention remained on Walter, studying him as if confirming what he already knew but could not fully accept. "You should not have had to do that," Daniel said quietly, the words directed only at Walter, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the store, nothing to do with the moment. Walter's expression did not change dramatically, but there was a slight shift, a softening at the edges that suggested understanding rather than surprise. "It is all right," Walter replied, his voice calm, steady, the same tone he had used before, as if the circumstances had not altered who he was. Gregory stepped closer now, his presence pressing back into the space. "Sir, I am going to need you to step aside while we finish this. You can file a complaint afterward if you would like." The words came out quicker this time, less controlled, more insistent, and finally Daniel turned his head, his gaze moving from Walter to Gregory. And in that shift, something in the room changed completely, because the calm that had defined Daniel's presence now sharpened into something else, something precise, something that carried weight without needing volume. He did not raise his voice, he did not step closer. He simply looked at Gregory with a focus that stripped away the performance. "Finish what exactly?" Daniel asked, his tone even, controlled, but edged with something that did not invite argument. Gregory hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the silence to stretch again, enough for the eyes of everyone nearby to shift back toward them, waiting, watching, sensing that the moment had crossed into something they did not fully understand yet. Walter stood quietly between them, the bag of bread and milk still at his feet, untouched, ordinary, and yet now it felt like the center of everything, as if something much larger was about to unfold from something so small. Gregory Steele opened his mouth, but the words did not come out the same way they had before. They hesitated somewhere between confidence and doubt, caught in the shift that had taken hold of the room. "Finish addressing the situation," he said finally, though the phrase sounded thinner now, less certain, as if it had lost its foundation the moment Daniel Hayes stepped into it. Daniel did not respond immediately. His gaze remained steady, fixed on Gregory with a calm intensity that made the space between them feel narrower than it was, not because of proximity, but because of focus. "You said he tried to leave," Daniel continued, his voice controlled, measured, each word placed carefully. "Did you see that happen?" Gregory straightened slightly, instinctively pulling himself back into the structure he understood. He had items in his possession without proof of payment. He replied, choosing his words with more care now, aware that the conversation had shifted beyond routine. And based on that, you decided to make him kneel? Daniel asked, not raising his voice, not adding pressure. Yet the question landed with more weight than any accusation could have. Gregory's jaw tightened, a brief flicker of irritation crossing his face before he masked it again. It is a standard deterrent policy, he said, though the explanation felt rehearsed even to him. The words, lacking the certainty they once carried. A faint murmur moved through the nearby shoppers, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present, as if the room itself was beginning to question what had been accepted just minutes earlier. Walter Hayes stood quietly beside Daniel now, his posture relaxed, his hands at his sides, no longer on the cold tile, yet the imprint of that moment still lingered in the way the scene held itself. He did not interrupt, he did not defend himself further. His silence now carried a different meaning, no longer just endurance, but presence. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward the small plastic bag on the floor, then back to Gregory. And you are certain, he said, that he intended to take something without paying? Gregory hesitated again, the pause longer this time, enough for it to be noticed. He did not have a receipt, he answered, though it sounded less like a conclusion and more like a justification searching for footing. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the answer without accepting it. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, the movement smooth, deliberate, drawing the attention of everyone nearby without needing to announce itself. He pulled out a wallet, not rushed, not dramatic, just precise, and from it, a simple credit card, which he held between his fingers for a moment before extending it slightly toward Gregory. Run this, he said, his tone unchanged, steady. For everything he has, and anything else he might need. Gregory blinked, the instruction catching him off guard. Sir, that is not the point, he replied quickly, the need to re-establish control surfacing again. This is about policy, not payment. Daniel's gaze did not waver. It has always been about payment, he said quietly. You just decided it was about something else. The words settled into the space with a quiet finality that made further argument feel smaller. Gregory's hand hovered for a moment before he took the card, his fingers brushing against it with a hesitation that would not have existed minutes earlier. He glanced toward the nearest register, then back at Daniel, as if searching for a version of the situation where he still held the upper ground. But it was no longer there. The shift had already happened. He just had not fully accepted it yet. The cashier, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward uncertainly, his eyes moving between Gregory and Daniel, waiting for direction that no longer came with the same clarity. Walter's gaze lowered briefly to the bag at his feet, then lifted again, not to Gregory, not to the crowd, but to Daniel. And in that look, there was something unspoken, something that did not belong to the store or the moment, something that reached beyond it. Daniel met that look, and for a second, the tension in his expression softened, not completely, but enough to reveal that whatever was unfolding here was not just about what had happened in the last few minutes. It was about something older, something unresolved, something that had just found its way back into the light. The card remained in Gregory Steele's hand a second longer than it should have, the thin piece of plastic suddenly heavier than its weight, as if it carried more than just a transaction. The cashier stepped closer, reaching for it with cautious fingers, eyes flicking up once toward Daniel Hayes before lowering again, uncertain, waiting for some signal that this was still a normal process. But nothing about the moment felt normal anymore. The register beeped softly as the screen lit up, the familiar glow casting a pale reflection across the counter. And yet no one spoke, not immediately, because something quieter had taken over the space, something that did not need words to hold attention. Walter Hayes stood beside the counter now, no longer on the floor, but the imprint of that moment lingered in the way his shoulders held themselves, not slumped, not broken, just still, like a man who had learned long ago how to carry what others tried to place on him without letting it define him. His eyes moved slowly across the store, not searching, not judging, just observing, taking in the small details that others overlooked, the flicker of a light above aisle 5, the faint hum of a refrigeration unit near the back, the quiet shifting of feet from people who did not know where to stand anymore. Daniel remained beside him, close enough that the distance between them felt intentional, not accidental, his posture composed again, but no longer distant. There was something grounded in it now, something anchored by the presence of the man next to him. Gregory cleared his throat once more, the sound sharper in the silence than it should have been. "We have standards to maintain," he said, though the words felt misplaced now, as if they had been pulled from a script that no longer fit the scene. Daniel did not look at him, his gaze resting instead on the small bag of bread and milk that the cashier had now carefully placed on the counter, the items scanned with soft beeps that echoed more loudly than usual, each one marking a step back towards something simple, something that should have remained simple from the beginning. The receipt printer whirred to life, spitting out a thin strip of paper that curled slightly at the edge. Ordinary, routine, and yet somehow significant in the quiet that surrounded it. Walter's hand moved slowly, almost absent-mindedly, brushing against the edge of the counter as if grounding himself in the physical space. The surface cool beneath his fingers, steady, real. Daniel noticed the movement, not because it was dramatic, but because it was small, and he seemed to notice small things now in a way he had not before. "You should not have had to wait," Daniel said quietly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between them. Walter glanced at him briefly, then back at the counter. "Waiting is not new," he replied, the words simple, without bitterness, without weight, just truth spoken plainly, and that simplicity seemed to settle into Daniel more deeply than anything else had, because it did not accuse, it did not demand, it simply existed. Gregory shifted again, his hands now empty, unsure where to place them, his earlier certainty replaced by something tighter, something less comfortable. He looked around the store, as if expecting support from the structure he represented, but the structure had grown quiet, distant. The crowd no longer mirrored his authority. They watched, but not in agreement, not in validation, just in awareness. The cashier extended the bag toward Walter with a tentative motion. "Sir," he said softly, the word carrying a different tone now, one that had not been there before. Walter accepted it with a slight nod, his grip gentle, careful, as if the contents mattered more than their cost. The plastic rustled again, but this time it sounded less like tension and more like something returning to its place. Daniel's hand hovered briefly near the counter, then lowered, his fingers resting lightly against the surface, not in control, not in command, just present. And for a moment, the entire store seemed to settle into a different kind of stillness, one that was not driven by pressure, but by recognition. Something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. And in that quiet, the fluorescent lights hummed steadily above. The doors opened and closed as they always did, and yet everything felt slightly different, as if the space itself had witnessed something it would not forget. Daniel Hayes remained still for a moment after the bag was handed back, his eyes resting not on the items, not on the counter, but on Walter Hayes, as if the space between them held more meaning than anything else in the store. The fluorescent lights above cast a steady glow across both of them, flattening shadows but not softening the weight of what had just unfolded. And then, almost quietly, almost like the words had to pass through something deeper before reaching the surface, Daniel spoke. "Again, you should not be here like this," he said, his voice low, not accusatory, not commanding, just honest in a way that did not belong to the environment they were standing in. Walter adjusted his grip on the bag slightly, the plastic folding softly under his fingers, and for a moment he did not answer, his gaze drifting toward the front doors again, watching as a couple walked in, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside. "Sometimes," Walter said finally, his tone calm, measured, "life does not ask where you should be." The words were simple, but they settled into the space with a quiet gravity. Daniel's jaw tightened, slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition, as if the statement carried a truth he had spent years avoiding. Behind them, Gregory Steele stood frozen in a place that no longer fit him, his earlier authority reduced to something uncertain, something smaller. His eyes moved between the two men as if trying to piece together a context he did not understand. "Sir," Gregory said again, though his voice lacked the structure it had before, "if there has been a misunderstanding, we can resolve it through proper channels." The phrase sounded formal, distant, disconnected from the moment it was meant to address. Daniel turned his head slowly, his gaze settling on Gregory once more, and this time there was no hesitation in it, no pause, just a clarity that cut through the remaining tension. "There is no misunderstanding," Daniel said, his tone even, but firm in a way that left little space for interpretation. Gregory swallowed slightly, the movement subtle but visible, his posture shifting, as if he was trying to reframe himself within a situation that had moved beyond his control. "Then I will make sure this is documented correctly," he added, reaching for something procedural, something safe, something that returned him to familiar ground. But Daniel did not respond to that, because his attention had already moved elsewhere. He stepped closer to Walter, not by much, just enough to narrow the distance between them, and when he spoke again, his voice changed, softer, more personal. "How long has it been?" he asked, the question quiet, almost careful. Walter looked at him fully now, not glancing, not shifting, just meeting his eyes with a steady calm that did not rush to answer. The silence stretched for a second, then another, as if the weight of time itself was being measured in that pause. "Long enough," Walter replied, his words carrying years without needing to count them. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it entered, and for the first time since he walked into the store, the controlled composure he carried began to give way to something else, something more human, something that could not be contained within posture or tone. His eyes lowered, briefly, then lifted again, searching Walter's face as if trying to reconcile the present with something he remembered, something he had lost track of along the way. "I thought," Daniel began, then stopped, the sentence dissolving before it could take shape. Walter's expression softened slightly, not with pity, not with judgment, just with understanding that did not require explanation. "I know what you thought," he said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, no edge, just a recognition that seemed to bridge the distance between them more than any explanation could. Around them, the store remained still, not frozen, but aware, the customers no longer pretending to look away, the employees no longer hiding behind routine. They watched, not for spectacle now, but for something else, something unfolding that felt larger than the moment itself. Gregory took a small step back without realizing it, his presence receding from the center of the scene as the focus shifted entirely. And in that shift, the dynamic that had defined everything just minutes earlier dissolved completely, replaced by something quieter, something deeper, something that no policy, no procedure, no authority could contain. And in the center of it, Daniel Hayes stood face to face with Walter Hayes, no longer separated by position or perception, but connected by a truth that had finally stepped into the light. Gregory Steele's composure finally cracked in a way that could not be hidden behind procedure or tone. The careful structure he had been holding on is slipping through his fingers as the reality in front of him became impossible to ignore. He looked from Daniel Hayes to Walter Hayes and back again, his eyes searching for something that would restore order, something that would return the moment to a version he could manage. But it was gone, replaced by a truth that stood quietly in front of him without needing to announce itself. "I did not know," Gregory said, the words coming out slower this time, stripped of the authority they once carried, his voice no longer projecting across the room, but settling closer, almost uncertain. Daniel turned toward him fully now, his expression no longer just controlled but deliberate, measured in a way that made every word matter before it was spoken. "You did not ask," Daniel replied, his tone even, not raised, not sharp, yet it landed with a weight that filled the space between them. Gregory swallowed again, his posture shifting as if he had suddenly become aware of every eye in the store. The phone still held up, the silence still present. The difference now was that the attention no longer validated him. It observed him, and that observation carried something heavier than approval ever could. "I was following what I believed was right," Gregory added, his voice tightening slightly as he tried to find footing. "We have rules for a reason." Daniel's gaze did not waver. "Rules are not meant to remove judgment," he said, the words quiet but firm. "They are meant to guide it." Gregory's shoulders dropped slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show the shift, enough to show that the certainty he relied on had been replaced by something more fragile. He looked toward Walter then, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, though it came late. "Sir," Gregory began, the word unfamiliar on his tongue in this context. If this caused any discomfort, he paused, the sentence faltering, the apology not yet fully formed. Walter watched him without interruption, his expression calm, unchanged, as if he was not waiting for the words, but simply allowing them space to exist. Gregory tried again. I should have handled it differently. He finished, the statement simple, stripped of justification, and in that simplicity there was something more honest than anything he had said before. The store remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one that listened rather than avoided. Daniel glanced briefly at Walter, as if deferring to something unspoken, and Walter gave the smallest nod, not approving, not dismissing, just acknowledging. You treated a moment like it was only a rule, Walter said gently, his voice steady, carrying no anger, no edge, just clarity. But moments are people. Gregory's eyes lowered slightly, the weight of that statement settling in a way his policies never had. He did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to explain. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that something had shifted, not resolved, but acknowledged. He stepped slightly to the side, creating space between himself and Gregory, not as rejection, but as a quiet reordering of where things stood now. Walter adjusted the bag in his hand again, the simple motion grounding him in the present. And for a brief moment, his eyes moved across the store one last time, taking in the people, the lights, the stillness that had witnessed everything, before returning to Daniel. You do not have to carry what is already understood, Walter said softly, his words directed at him, but meant for more than just the moment. Daniel met his gaze, and something in his expression softened fully now. The controlled distance replaced by something more open, more human, something that no longer needed to be hidden behind position or expectation. Gregory stepped back again, this time intentionally, his presence no longer at the center, his role in the moment reduced not by force, but by understanding, and in that shift, the scene settled into something quieter, something that did not need to be resolved loudly, because the truth had already done its work, and all that remained was what each person chose to carry forward from it. The automatic doors opened again with their soft mechanical sigh, letting in a thin stream of cold air that brushed lightly across the polished floor, and for the first time since the moment began, the store started to move again, not abruptly, not all at once, but slowly, cautiously, as if everyone present needed a second to remember what normal felt like. A cart rolled forward, a scanner beeped, a quiet conversation resumed somewhere near the back aisle. But at the front, where everything had shifted, the stillness lingered just a little longer. Walter Hayes adjusted the bag in his hand, the light weight of bread and milk grounding him in something simple, something real, and he turned slightly toward the exit, not in haste, not in avoidance, just with the quiet intention of continuing forward. Daniel Hayes remained beside him for a moment, watching that movement as if it carried more meaning than any words could. Then he stepped with him, not ahead, not behind, but alongside, matching his pace without needing to say so. Gregory Steele stayed where he was, his hands now still at his sides, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, as if he was standing in a place that no longer belonged to him. His eyes followed them briefly, then lowered, not in defeat, but in reflection, something in his expression softer now, quieter, shaped by a moment that had moved beyond his control and into understanding. The cashier returned to his register, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he was aware that something had changed even in the smallest actions. The receipt paper curled slightly at the edge of the counter, forgotten, unneeded. The fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum, unchanged, indifferent to what had unfolded beneath them. Yet somehow the space they illuminated felt different, as if it carried the memory of what had just happened. Walter reached the doors first, pausing only briefly as they slid open again, the outside air meeting him fully now, colder, sharper, but honest in a way that the artificial brightness inside could never be. Daniel slowed slightly at the threshold, his gaze shifting from the parking lot to Walter, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what mattered had already been understood. Walter stepped forward into the open space, the gravel crunching faintly under his worn shoes, the sky above a muted gray that stretched without interruption. Daniel followed, the sound of his steps softer now, less defined by polished floors and more by the uneven ground outside. The distance between them remained small, intentional, as if neither of them was willing to let the moment drift away just yet. Walter looked ahead, not back, his posture steady, his pace unhurried, and Daniel glanced once over his shoulder, back toward the store, where the glass doors had already closed again, sealing the scene behind them. The reflections in the glass showed only movement now, ordinary, routine, as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. He turned forward again, his focus returning to the man beside him, and for a brief second, his hand moved slightly, not reaching, not forcing, just there, close enough to offer without demanding. Walter noticed, not with surprise, not with hesitation, just with a quiet awareness, and he adjusted his path just enough to walk beside it, not leaning, not relying, simply accepting the presence. The wind moved lightly across the lot, carrying with it the distant sounds of passing cars and shifting leaves, and in that open space, away from the fluorescent lights and the watching eyes, the moment settled into something quieter, something that did not need to be explained or justified, something that simply existed between them. And as they walked forward together, step by step, the world did not change around them. The sky remained gray. The air remained cold. The day continued as it always would. But something within it had shifted, something small and unseen, carried not in words or actions, but in the quiet space where understanding lives. And in that space, no one spoke, because no one needed to. The silence itself was enough.